Hi, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Audrey Loper. I'm an implementation specialist at the UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work, and we really hope you enjoyed the opportunity to engage with the supplement authors and your fellow attendees and gather some takeaways for your own work supporting equitable implementation. We just wanted to give a quick reminder that the videos from all 8 of the breakouts will be made available to you after the webinar, and we really do encourage you to take a look. They're also fantastic and inspiring and just lift up such beautiful examples of what it means to engage in implementation work that centers equity. So in the supplement, we close with a set of 10 recommendations to advance equitable implementation. And these recommendations are really our attempt to summarize what we learned during our time working on the supplement with this just incredible group of authors. And to close us out today, we invited Ioma Iruka to reflect on and interpret these recommendations with us. Dr. Iruka is a research professor of public policy and the founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC. She's engaged in a wide array of projects and initiatives focused on how evidence-informed policies, systems, and practices in early childhood education can support the optimal development and experiences of children from low-income and ethnic minority households. Unfortunately, Dr. Iruka wasn't able to join us today, but she did sit down with Allison Metz for a conversation about the recommendations, which we'll turn to now. Even though Ioma isn't with us, I think her energy and passion and expertise just come through in this video. So we really look forward to sharing it with you. Feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat as we watch the video, and then we'll have a chance to reflect on those comments and questions at the close. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. So I'm Allison Metz, a professor at the School of Social Work at UNC Chapel Hill, and I am joined by Ioma Iruka, who is a professor in the Department of Public Policy, also at UNC Chapel Hill, and a faculty fellow at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. Ioma is also the founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at FPG. And we're just so thrilled, Ioma, to have you join us today. We're going to spend a little time reflecting on the recommendations for equitable implementation that we shared in the supplement that are really based on the incredible work of all the authors that contributed to the supplement. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So before we jump into some of the recommendations that emerged from the case examples in the supplement, wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about what is equitable implementation. So in the supplement, we put forth a proposed definition of equitable implementation, but I would love to hear in your words how you would define and think about equitable implementation in your work.
So first, thank you for having me. And I want to say really kudos to you and all the editors and the authors for this, I think, really amazing piece. And I appreciate that the writing was not just coming from white people only or university-based people, but from practitioners, funders, community organizers, and so many more. So just thank you. And so I actually also appreciate your definition of equitable implementation. And I would actually expand it a little bit to for me, when I think about equity, I do think about exactly fairness, justice, and removing obstacles, right? And making sure that we give people what they need to thrive and reach their potential. And I would say, I would even add to that, that it's important that we think about the history and culture, but also focus on disrupting oppression, issues of dehumanization, marginalization, right? So most of the time we're trying to help those communities and people who have been oppressed or marginalized. And to me, implementation science and equity in particular should be the bridge between science, administration, policies, and the community. And so there must be some level of activation in being the ally, creating allyship, because in the end of it, being passive is not good enough if we're trying to create transformation and liberation. So for me, I would say continue to push on how do you actually begin to sort of dismantle any sort of oppressive structures and systems.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And a call to action kind of right away in terms of us amending that definition and adding to that activation that you just noted. Thank you so much. Several of the authors in the supplement talked about working with communities to develop and define their own evidence, as well as engaging community members in interpreting data and figuring out the best actions to take based on those data. And it's a really, important conversation, implementation science, which kind of rose up with the evidence-based practice movement and this kind of pushing out of evidence-based programs to different communities. And here in the supplement, there was really a call to action around working with communities to define their own evidence. And I wondered, as a researcher, how have you engaged with communities in building evidence, and how do you see that contributing to equitable implementation?
Yeah, and I think it's, and I so appreciated the articles that really, I think, highlighted that, when we use the term evidence-based, right, that is always a question of whose evidence, whose standard, et cetera. So I think that's important that we begin to really press on what is evidence. And I would say for me, especially coming from sort of as a researcher who, has done a lot of community engaged or research and policy relevant research, I've been on a journey. I would say that I've always wanted to do things that really impacted communities of color, especially Black communities. I mean, for me, I remembered as a graduate student, when I started my PhD at University of Miami, I wasn't a grand focus on Head Start and this, approach to learning. I would even talk about what approach to learning is. But I found myself not just talking about the study with families, but also just talking with families about what are you experiencing? Why do you like Head Start? What is it that your children are trying to get? Why did you even choose Head Start? And so for me, that was gathering evidence about what outcomes should we be focusing on rather than just the one outcome we were supposed to be doing with the grant. And so for me, every webinar I do, every meeting that I attend or I'm a part of, whether from Durham Pre-K program or Child Care Commission or Head Start meetings, whatever, I'm always listening for what can I as a researcher do better? Like, what are the outcomes should I be looking for? And not just what I think from sort of the regular, research. So for example, I'm starting a series of projects really focusing on Black families' cultural wealth. And this came to me because for I don't know how many years, talking with Black families is like, they're like, well, why come all the studies only talk about all the negative part? They don't talk about what we do to keep our children safe psychologically, mentally, to deal with the oppressive society that pretty much says Black people are not good enough. So for me, it became even more obvious and transparent when I became a parent to my first child, almost 8 years ago. And I recognized that my parents, and as a Black parent, compared to my colleagues and friends who are white, was not always the same. That I had these other things I was trying to do that was not just about negative or preparation for biases and racism, but also about making sure that they appreciated, being Black, that there was joy and sort of strength with being Black. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that that story of the cultural wealth of Black people and families are being told. So for me, back to sort of your point about sort of evidence, I think part of it is that we have to ask the community, what is it that you need? Not what we think you need. So to me, part of that is actually going through that sort of bridge building, that sort of collaboration and partnership that really says, what should I be doing? And what are the outcomes that's most important for you, right? In some instances, we want to talk about, want to make sure that you have highways. That's great. But if I don't have a car, I don't care for a highway. I want to make sure that my community is safe from violence, right? So I think it's being able to ask what is most pressing for community and see it through their eyes and not so much our eyes, right? Because some of our eyes are really filled with privilege and not really thinking about the history and what communities really want. So to me, part of that is really how do we make sure that we are looking at things from the vantage point of the community, from the history, from their lived experiences. And we can't do that because a lot of us don't have those sort of skill sets. And so being able to really make sure that we center the communities, center families, center those who are really trying to reach is sort of the decision making. So for me, it's actually just listening, right? That's the key. Number one is just listen and also to observe. And I think that would really help us.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic. And I really encourage folks to, as they think about what you said, to kind of go back to the supplement and take a look at those case examples of that we can work with communities to define their own evidence, that it can be done. And there's some great examples of that. Thank you so much. One of the other things that came out in the supplement, as we looked across the case examples, is how important it is to identify and use implementation strategies that will impact contextual factors that contribute to disparities in outcomes. So we know that a lot of these contextual factors kind of sit within the macro context, that they're historical, that they're structural, that they're embedded in policy, and that many of the implementation strategies that we currently use are really at organization or practice level. It's not that those strategies aren't helpful, but they when used alone will not contribute to decreasing disparities in outcomes. And so I wondered if you might talk a little bit about your experience in identifying or testing strategies that really do impact those contextual factors related to outcomes, and how can we do a better job in implementation science, both in our research and practice, for prioritizing the testing of strategies that will in fact impact disparities in outcomes.
So sadly, Alice, I feel like I come to this question, and so for those who are listening, I come to this with sort of sadly that a lot of the work that I've done, I felt in many ways, has been exactly at the level that wasn't as important, right? Right, we have randomized control trials of programs, of family interventions, of really trying to quote unquote fix children, fix programs, fix families, fix something, right? And through sort of the approach of randomized control trials, some level of control, right? Because you're trying to control as much as possible. But the problem, and I feel like for me, being on a journey, a sort of how do I make sure that my research is as impactful as possible, is recognizing that those are good, but is it going to really change and create that transformation, that liberation? No, right? How do you control for racism, right? How do you control for sexism, right? People control for race in their studies, but you can't control for racism because it's literally the air that we breathe, is the water we swim in. And so, and how do you control a community dynamic that's organic? You can't, right? And so I think we have to first recognize that there are things that we have never fully studied. We have not fully, we can't study, what does it mean if there's no longer racism? I don't know, because the world is racist, right? We're racist, we're sexist, we're xenophobic. It's hard to control that out. So, however, I do think it's important that those studies that focus on micro issues are important, right? They help to give us little nuggets of where we can make some subtle changes and hopefully begin to create those ripple in the water. Right. But I think it's important that we begin to sort of center, for me, for the work that I'm doing around with the Equity Research Action Coalition, is really trying to understand what are some of the big things that we can do. And big, is relative, right? But really looking at policies, right? Like thinking about the American Rescue Plan, right? We talk a lot about, can that particular policy that was just passed, could it sort of, address poverty? People mentioned it's going to, erase, reduce the Black poverty rate and Latino poverty rate by 50% that I hope that's the case. We can actually test that, right? If you actually give money, give cash money, don't give me your programs, don't give me your stuff, give me cash money. Does that change not just my economic sort of viability, but my sense that I can thrive, my sense that there's possibility? So to me, those are the things that we can begin to do, and see policies help to shape that. And so for me, when I close my eyes, to think through this issue, and what I'm doing now is really about recognizing, are there some bigger things we can do? So that means that looking at sort of policies, looking at some things about systems change, looking at sort of how do we make sure that the systems we have created are not marginalizing groups of people. We know from the way we fund things that we marginalize people. So to me, when I sort of think about sort of the question of how do we begin to design strategies, is you can't do programming. You have to actually design policy strategies, but also implementation, looking at the implementation of the policies, right? Because we can have great policies, but if we don't look at how is the funding being distributed, if we don't look at where are the sort of the levers of change, is it directed to the communities that most need it, or is it just equal across the board? So being able to go deeper, for me, being able to go deeper into sort of the policies themselves, but also how they're being implemented, and then how are people brought in to begin to test out whether or not this policy is working, say, for Black people, for Latino people, for Indigenous people, being able to actually ask those questions and actually gather data. Right. So we can't do sort of colorblind, let's just see if this works for everybody. No, we have to actually be active in saying, are we actually eradicating sort of disparities by race, by income, by where you live, geography. So to me, part of being able to do work is to really begin to examine policies and strategies that are supposed to affect change that are much larger than just sort of these small individual. And to me, that's kind of where we need to begin to go and sort of think about. So if you're not measuring those kind of big sort of policy changes, big institutional changes, then by just working with individuals and maybe even one organization may not get us there. It's going to continue to maintain the system. And to me, that's still doing sort of racist work. And we have to continue to move towards doing anti-racist and sort of racial equity work. That to me is how we're going to begin to really address disparities at racial, economic, and other sort of socio-demographic characteristics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And it is something I think that the field of implementation science has to grapple with, which is that in many ways it has focused on programs and not on policies, and really the levers that we really need to be pulling to decrease disparities and outcomes are really at that macro level. So your example of policy implementation and how we study that and measure that and include that in all of our designs is, I think, incredible food for thought for all of the implementation researchers and practitioners out there. As we close out this incredible conversation, we're packing a lot in here. I'd love for you to share any final thoughts you have related to how implementation science can do a better job of focusing on advancing equity. Kind of where do you see the field? What's kind of your own call to action for us as we kind of end our session today?
I'll give you three quick things. One is to think about implementation that leads to equitable access, experiences, and outcomes, create safe spaces to really build a community focused on healing, transformation, and liberation. And finally, focus on preserving community, cultural heritage and stories, protect them from harm, and promote their health and economic stability. Those are my sort of threes that I will leave you with. So thank you for this opportunity to talk with you.
Those are incredible and perfect three things to end on, an incredible call to action for everyone that joined us today, and we'll get a chance to listen to this video in the future as well. Thank you so much, Ioma, and we're deeply grateful for your time.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. I'm just scrolling through the chat and really enjoying all these comments. A lot of common themes here about the value and importance of lifting up the experiences of individuals, families, and communities in our implementation work. There's a great comment here around working on outcomes that matter to the community instead of our own hypotheses as researchers, and a question on how much do funding agencies appreciate this, which is such a great question. I don't know if the team from Amplify Fund is still with us, but maybe think of their paper and the way that they partnered with Arch City Defenders in St. Louis to focus on what the community's outcomes were rather than their own as a funders group. And they have a fantastic funders checklist in their paper as well. So really encourage folks to take a look at that if they haven't seen it yet. Great comment here about the importance of having pathways for researchers of color to engage in equity research. Noted that seems to be missing from the list of recommendations. So glad that you named this, but definitely something that the literature says is vital to addressing health equity in communities of color. So glad to see that in the chat. Someone noted a great example of helping non-tax filers apply for the child tax credit. I think this was related to the question of Yoma's comment about let's just give folks money instead of more programs. And someone else noted just a lot of really great evidence to support the idea of things like universal basic income. Oh, such a nice comment here about this being a great session today. Thank you so much, Marilyn, and that it would be great if this could be an ongoing community of practice where we could regularly reconvene and keep learning together. I love that idea. Let's see some additional comments here about direct income supports to families. Let's see here. Pride and self is something we all attempt to instill in one another. Freckles, hues, scars, curls, and wrinkles. I love that. And the opportunity to present that inclusiveness for all experiences and identities when encouraging pride while also avoiding hierarchical systems or judgment of those who are not exactly precious in each of our own rights. Celebration of uniqueness rather than judgment. Thank you for that, Kimberly. Some agreement around the Learning Collaborative, which is so great to see. The importance of working at multiple levels, but acknowledging that bad or harmful policies will trump good programs and frameworks. So really another, call to action there, I think, sort of echoing what Ioma noted at the end of her remarks, just around the importance of policy. A note here about how it would be great to see research and tools for identifying policies that have the worst impacts. That would be a great resource. Laura shared that it is Indigenous Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada today. So a timely reflection, engagement activity for you. I'm glad that worked out for you, Laura. Let's see here. It's really so nice to see all these plus ones around reconvening. We're just so glad that you enjoyed your time with us today. Looks like there's some questions around possibly sharing slides from the opening plenary. So I believe that's part of the plan. I will lift that up just to the event organizers as part of the materials that we send out afterwards. This is so lovely from someone in Sydney, Australia, that it was worth a late night / early morning. We're so delighted that you joined us all the way from Australia, and so glad you felt like it was a good use of a late night, early morning. Thanks, Isandra. She loves the recommendation around doing more to protect communities and promoting cultural wealth, a great aspect for equitable implementation. Thanks so much, Rachel. Rachel just noted in the chat that she's happy to share slides. So thanks so much. I'm noticing the time. It's 12:58. I am going to pass it back over to Allison to close us out. But just again, thank you so much for all of your engagement during the closing plenary.
We had just incredible numbers today. Just so folks know, I think we had over 1,000 people register for this event. I think we had almost half of you live in the beginning, and we've kept so many of you for these 2 hours. So we're so grateful. We're going to drop the link to evaluate this event in the chat, so you can see it there. Heidi just dropped it in there. We look at those evaluations every single time, so please fill that out. As noted, we always do share the recordings of the plenaries as well. They on the event site, they typically get up within just a couple of days. And then also we do have those recordings of the interviews with all the authors that Audrey mentioned that are also available on the event site. So there's lots of ways to access this material. We will get things out to folks. I know there's that list of citations folks will be looking for. We will definitely collate everything, and over the course of the next week, start getting that up and communicating with folks to let them know it's there. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers, to Dr. Shelton, Dr. Ode, Dr. Adsul, finishing with Dr. Aruka today. It was amazing. UNC School of Social Work is also really grateful for our partnership with the Annie Casey Foundation. And I'd like to thank Rive, our event planning team today, who I think knocked it out of the park. There were a lot of moving parts. And so thank you so much, and have an incredible day wherever you are, whatever time it is, whether you eat pumpkins or not. And we will see you next time.